They called it a graveyard of bad decisions. 400 acres of poisoned dirt that had already broken 3 generations of men. When a broke single mother decided to plant a forest there, they laughed. 10 years later, a billionaire offered her $15 million to walk away. The shovel hit the dirt and bounced. The vibration traveled up the fiberglass handle, rattled through Maeve's blistered palms, and settled deep in her shoulders as a dull, pulsing ache. She leaned on the spade, spitting a mouthful of dust onto the ground. The spit beaded up and rolled across the grey, cracked surface. The earth here didn't even want water. 50 yards away, parked on the edge of a dry wash, sat a rust-eaten 1998 Ford F-250. In the cab, her 7-year-old son, Leo, was colouring in a superhero book. The windows rolled down to catch whatever miserable breeze managed to crawl across the basin. This was Maeve's inheritance, 400 acres of high desert alkali flats in eastern Oregon. Her ex-husband, Pete, had bought it in a manic phase, convinced he was going to grow hemp, or run cattle, or build a solar farm. He'd drained their savings, signed a predatory loan, and then wrapped his motorcycle around a telephone pole on a rainy Tuesday in Portland. He left Maeve with a mountain of debt, a grieving child, and a deed to a patch of earth so dead that even the coyotes avoided it. The bank took the house in the suburbs. They took the decent car. They didn't take the land, because the land was functionally worthless. The county assessor had valued it at less than the cost of the barbed wire needed to fence it. So Maeve and Leo moved into a single-wide trailer sitting on cinder blocks at the edge of the property line. Locals in town looked at her with that specific brand of rural pity reserved for dead men's wives and city fools. At the feed store, an old rancher named Harlan had leaned against the counter and given it to her straight. "You can't grow nothing out there, Maeve. The soil's saline. The water table is 50 feet down through solid caliche. Sell it to the state for a shooting range and take the boy somewhere with grass." But Maeve didn't have the money to leave. She had a negative bank balance, a part-time job answering phones at a dental clinic, and a quiet, burning rage that kept her awake at night. She was trapped. If she couldn't leave the land, she had to make it live. She couldn't afford irrigation pivots. She couldn't afford alfalfa seed or fertilizer by the ton. But one night, scouring the internet on a cracked phone screen, she found a state-subsidized forestry program. Bare root saplings, hybrid poplars, drought-tolerant junipers, and black locusts. They were meant for windbreaks, subsidized at 30 cents a stem. She bought 3,000 of them. When the delivery truck dropped off the bundles, they didn't look like trees. They looked like dead twigs wrapped in wet burlap. Maeve started digging. She woke at 4 in the morning, before the sun could turn the basin into a blast furnace. She strapped a 250-gallon IBC tote to the bed of the Ford, filled it from the sluggish, sulfur-smelling well near the trailer, and drove out into the wasteland. It was brutal, mechanical work. Swing the pickaxe, break the crust, scrape out the alkaline dust, drop in a twig, pack it with a handful of compost she'd begged from a dairy farmer down the highway, water it, move 3 feet, repeat. She did this for weeks. Her hands calloused over, split open, and bled into the soil. She lost 15 pounds she didn't have to lose. Her cheekbones sharpened, her eyes hollowed out. Some days the wind howled across the flats, kicking up blinding clouds of white dust that coated her skin and tasted like salt and failure. By the end of the first summer, 90% of the saplings were dead. They stood in the cracked earth like brittle, mocking toothpicks. The heat had fried them. The salt had choked them. Maeve sat on the tailgate of her truck in the twilight, staring at the graveyard of her own making. Leo was asleep in the cab. She held a dead poplar sapling in her hand. The root system hadn't grown an inch. It had just curled in on itself and surrendered. She wanted to cry. She wanted to scream at the sky, at Pete, at the bank, at the sheer, indifferent cruelty of the dirt. But she didn't. Crying dehydrated you, and out here, water was currency. Instead, she researched. She read academic papers on soil remediation until her eyes blurred. She learned about mycorrhizal fungi, microscopic networks that attach to roots and help them mine for water and nutrients. She learned about deep-ripping the soil to break the caliche layer. The next spring, she didn't buy 3,000 trees. She bought 7,000. She maxed out her last credit card to rent a rusted diesel tractor with a subsoiler shank. She spent 2 weeks dragging a massive steel blade through the hardpan, tearing open the earth, exposing the darker, cooler soil beneath. She inoculated the new roots with fungi spores. She planted deep taproot species first, honey mesquite and black locust, trees designed by evolution to survive hell. She worked with a grim, mechanical detachment. She wasn't motivated by a love of nature. She was motivated by sheer defiance. The world had tried to bury her under this dirt. She was going to make it yield. This time, the die-off was only 50%. By year 3, the black locusts had taken hold. They were scrubby, twisted, and ugly, but they were green. And more importantly, their aggressive roots were fracturing the subterranean hardpan, creating microscopic channels. When the rare autumn rains came, the water didn't pool on the surface and evaporate into the salt. It sank. Nature is not a gentle thing. It is a biological machine. It operates on leverage, momentum, and brutal efficiency. Once Maeve gave it a foothold, the machine turned on. 5 years after she planted the first dead twig, the basin was unrecognizable from the highway. The black locusts had grown to 15 feet, their canopies interlocking to form a dense windbreak. Behind them, shielded from the scouring winds, the hybrid poplars had exploded upward. Cottonwoods anchored the edges of the dry wash. The constant shedding of leaves created a thick mulch over the cracked earth, trapping moisture, dropping the soil temperature, and inviting the invisible army of beetles, earthworms, and microbes that manufacture living dirt. The water table, no longer blocked by the impenetrable caliche, began to stabilize. The dry wash at the center of the property, which hadn't seen running water since the 1990s, developed a slow, muddy trickle in the spring. Maeve was no longer the crazy widow in the trailer. She was the architect of an oasis. She still looked weathered. Her skin was permanently tanned, her hands rough as coarse grit sandpaper. But her posture had changed. The crushing weight of survival had been replaced by the quiet confidence of a woman who had fought the earth and forced a draw. Leo was 12 now, tall for his age, spending his weekend setting up trail cameras in the groves to catch footage of the mule deer and foxes that had mysteriously appeared out of the scrub to claim the new territory. But a green anomaly in a brown landscape doesn't just attract wildlife, it attracts algorithms. The first sign of trouble didn't come in a suit. It came from the sky. Maeve was patching a drip line when she heard the high-pitched whine. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun, and saw a sleek, multi-rotor drone holding steady 100 feet above her canopy. It wasn't a hobbyist's toy. It was commercial grade, heavily stabilized, its camera lens catching the light. A week later, a black Lincoln Navigator rolled up the long dirt driveway, its suspension protesting the ruts. A man stepped out. He wore a tailored slate-gray suit that had no business being in a zip code that didn't have a Starbucks. He introduced himself as Mr. Cross, a representative of Apex Holdings. "It's a remarkable thing you've done here, Mrs. Sullivan," Cross said, his eyes scanning the dense rows of poplars. He didn't look at the trees the way a forester would. He looked at them the way an auditor looks at a spreadsheet. "It's Maeve," she said, leaning on her shovel. "And I'm not selling." She hadn't even heard an offer, but she knew the script. Cross smiled, a thin, practiced movement. Apex Holdings is looking to develop a specialized facility in the region. Your parcel? Well, it's uniquely suited to our needs. The geological stability, the newly established watershed. We are prepared to offer you $1.2 million. Cash. You could leave this trailer today. $1.2 million. The number hung in the hot air. 5 years ago, Maeve would have wept at the idea of $1,000. $1.2 million was enough to buy a house in a good school district, pay for Leo's college, and sleep 8 hours a night for the rest of her life. But Maeve knew how to read dirt, and she was learning how to read men. Cross was too eager. His shoes were getting ruined in the mud, but he wasn't stepping back. He needed this land. The answer is no, she said, picking up her shovel. Cross blinked. The smile faltered. Mrs. Sullivan, the county assesses this land at barely $50,000. We are offering you a premium that is, frankly, irrational. You planted trees on a dead lot. Take the win. The lot isn't dead anymore, Mr. Cross. And if it's so irrational, why are you wearing Italian leather in a mud puddle to beg me for it? Maeve turned her back on him and walked into the trees. Over the next 6 months, the offers escalated. They came via registered mail, then phone calls, then unannounced visits from increasingly senior executives. 2 million. 4 million. 7.5 million. The local town, which had spent years mocking her, turned feral with gossip. People who hadn't spoken to her in a decade suddenly showed up at her gate, offering unsolicited advice, asking for loans against her future windfall, calling her an idiot for holding out. Harlan at the feed store told her she was playing Russian roulette with a loaded gun. But Maeve was busy digging. She hired a crew to help her plant the final quadrant. She wasn't holding out for more money. She genuinely didn't want to sell. This forest was the only thing she had ever built that hadn't broken. It was her sweat, her blood, her grief materialized into 50-foot tall pillars of wood and leaves. Then the mystery of Apex Holdings broke wide open. A tech journalist from Seattle published a piece exposing the shell company. Apex Holdings wasn't a real estate developer. It was a proxy for Gideon Roth. Roth was a billionaire titan of the tech industry, a man whose companies built the servers that ran half the modern internet. He was currently caught in a massive public relations nightmare regarding the astronomical energy and water usage of his data centers. Roth didn't want Maeve's land to build houses. He wanted it because he needed to build his newest, most massive AI data center in the high desert, where land was cheap and natural disasters were rare. But data centers generate heat. They require millions of gallons of water for cooling, water that the local government wouldn't let him tap from the depleted aquifers, unless he owned a property that had functionally regenerated its own localized watershed. A property that held the riparian rights to a newly flowing, biologically filtered water source. A property that would also look fantastic in a corporate ESG report about green development. Maeve's 400 acres of spite-planted trees was the linchpin to a multi-billion-dollar tech infrastructure project. The day after the article dropped, the black SUVs returned. But this time, it wasn't a proxy who stepped out of the lead car. It was Gideon Roth himself. He didn't wear a suit. He wore faded jeans and a plain black t-shirt, the universal uniform of a man so rich he didn't need to dress up to terrify people. He stood at the edge of the tree line, looking at the dense canopy, and then looked at Maeve, who was covered in grease from repairing the tractor. 15 million, Roth said. No introduction, no pleasantries. His voice was flat, accustomed to immediate compliance. $15 million, wired to your account by close of business tomorrow. You keep the trucks, you keep the equipment, you just sign the deed. Maeve wiped her hands on a rag. She looked at the billionaire, then looked past him, into the deep, cool green of the forest she had clawed out of the apocalypse. Gideon Roth didn't fidget. He stood perfectly still, his expensive sneakers sinking a fraction of an inch into the damp, decomposing leaf litter. He looked at Maeve with the blank, evaluating stare of a man who spent his life optimizing systems. To him, Maeve wasn't a person. She was a bottleneck in a supply chain. 15 million, Maeve repeated. The words felt heavy on her tongue, clumsy and absurd in the quiet air of the forest. Cash, Roth confirmed. No escrow games, no financing contingencies. My legal team has the transfer documents in that car. You sign, the wire clears, and you can pack your things. Maeve looked at the black SUVs idling on the dirt road. She wiped a smudge of grease from her forehead with the back of her wrist. What are you going to do with it? The land. Roth slipped his hands into his pockets. He didn't bother with the corporate spin his proxies had used. We're going to level the interior 200 acres. The perimeter trees will remain. They provide an excellent visual and acoustic buffer for the local township. But the center gets poured with 6-inch reinforced concrete, 4 server warehouses, a dedicated substation. And the water? Maeve asked. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. The servers generate heat. Immense heat, Roth said, as if explaining an algebra problem to a child. We need the aquifer you've so efficiently restored for the cooling systems. The water gets pumped up, cycled through the heat exchangers, and vented as steam. It's entirely carbon neutral. It is the greenest data center in North America. Everyone wins. Maeve turned her head. Through the dense timber of the hybrid poplars, she could see the silver glint of the dry wash. It wasn't dry anymore. It was a slow, muddy creek lined with vibrant green cottonwood shoots. Below the surface, an intricate, invisible architecture of mycorrhizal fungi and taproots was holding the earth together, hoarding every drop of the rain, forcing life into dirt that had been dead since the Reagan administration. Roth was talking about boiling it away. $15 million. Her mind did the math, involuntary and cruel. It was enough to send Leo to a private university out east. It was enough to buy a house in the hills of Portland, with a kitchen that didn't smell like propane, and a foundation that didn't rattle when the wind blew. It was the end of waking up in a panic at 3 a.m., wondering if the well pump had burned out. It was the absolute, permanent end of being poor. All she had to do was let this man murder her forest. The silence stretched. A red-tailed hawk shrieked somewhere in the upper canopy. You think this is a math problem, Maeve said. Roth tilted his head. Everything is a math problem, Maeve. Your debt is a math problem. This dirt was a math problem, and credit where it's due, you solved it. You hacked the soil biology, it's brilliant. But you've reached the limit of your scale. Take the payout. Maeve looked down at her hands. The knuckles were permanently swollen. The skin was scarred, deeply lined with ingrained dirt that no amount of scrubbing could ever remove. This forest hadn't just grown out of the soil, it had grown out of her marrow. She had bled into this earth when no one else on the planet cared if she lived or died. The trees were the only things that had fought back with her. She looked up at Roth. No. Roth's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened, a microscopic fracture in his composure. Excuse me? I said no, Maeve said, dropping the greasy rag into the toolbox on the tractor. I don't care how many zeros you put on the paper. You don't get to pave this. Get off my land. For the first time, Roth looked at her not as a variable, but as a threat. The billionaire didn't yell. He didn't threaten her with violence. He just nodded, a slow, cold movement. You think you're being noble, Roth said softly. You think you're protecting something sacred. But you're just a woman living in a trailer on an unpermitted foundation. You have property taxes you can barely afford. You have a county water board that hasn't officially recognized your riparian rights to that creek. You are incredibly vulnerable, Maeve. If I can't buy this land, I will just take it." He turned and walked back to the SUV. The doors slammed shut. The convoy rolled down the driveway, leaving a cloud of white dust in its wake. Maeve stood alone in the trees. Her hands were shaking so hard she had to grip the steel fender of the tractor just to stay upright. The adrenaline was draining out of her, replaced by a cold, crushing dread. She had just declared war on a man who bought state senators for sport. Leo walked out from the trailer, holding a peanut butter sandwich. He looked at the dust settling on the road. "Who was that?" Maeve looked at her son. She took a deep breath, forcing the tremor out of her chest. "Just a man who wants to buy the trees, buddy." "Did you sell them?" "No," she said. She reached out and ruffled his hair. "No, we're keeping them." The siege began on a Tuesday. It didn't come with bulldozers. It came in thick manila envelopes delivered by certified mail. First, the county assessor's office sent a notice of reappraisal. They claimed that the improvements to the land, the timber, voided her agricultural tax exemption. Her property tax bill jumped from $400 a year to $22,000, payable in 90 days. A week later, the State Department of Environmental Quality sent an inspector. Someone had filed an anonymous complaint alleging that Maeve had illegally diverted an underground waterway. The inspector, a tired man with a clipboard, slapped a cease and desist order on her well. Then came the letters from Apex Holdings' legal department, threatening to sue her for bad faith negotiations and claiming a prescriptive easement over her access road. Roth was suffocating her. He was applying systemic pressure, closing every valve, waiting for her to break. The locals in town, reading about the escalating legal battles in the regional paper, shook their heads. "She should have taken the money," they whispered at the diner. "Pride comes before the fall." Maeve stopped sleeping. She spent her nights at the kitchen table in the trailer, surrounded by legal notices and final warnings, the glow of her laptop illuminating the dark circles under her eyes. She was out of money. Her credit was destroyed. The machinery of Roth's empire was grinding her down, exactly as he had calculated. She needed a weapon. But she couldn't fight him with capital. She had to fight him with the only thing she actually possessed: the dirt. She drove to Portland, parking her battered Ford outside a sleek glass building downtown. She sat in the waiting room of a non-profit environmental law firm for 3 hours before a lawyer named Reed finally agreed to see her. Reed was a cynic in a cheap suit, a man who spent his life losing battles against chemical companies and logging conglomerates. He looked at Maeve's file, looked at the drone photos of the forest, and sighed. "They're going to bleed you dry, Maeve," Reed said, tossing the tax notices onto his desk. "Roth's lawyers will keep you in court for a decade. Even if you win the water rights, they'll foreclose on the tax debt. They own the board." "I don't care about the board," Maeve said. She leaned forward, placing her scarred hands flat on his glass desk. "I want to know how to make the land worthless to him," Reed frowned. "Worthless? He wants it because he can build a data center on it. He needs the commercial zoning and the water rights. What happens if the land can never be developed? By anyone. Ever?" Reed stared at her. The gears in his head slowly turned. He sat back in his chair. "You're talking about an irrevocable conservation easement, a land trust." "Explain it," she demanded. "You transfer the development rights of the property to a federally recognized land trust. You rewrite the deed. It legally prohibits any commercial development, paving, or industrial water extraction in perpetuity. The land can only ever be used for conservation or light agriculture." Maeve didn't blink. "And if I do that?" "If you do that," Reed said slowly, "the commercial value of the land drops to 0. Roth won't want it, because he legally couldn't pour a single yard of concrete on it. But Maeve, it also means you can never sell it to a developer. You are taking a property that a billionaire is willing to pay $15 million for, and you are intentionally turning its market value back to pennies. You are setting $14,900,000 on fire. Can I still live on it? Yes. You retain a life estate. You and your son can live there, manage the forest, harvest selective timber. But you will never be rich. Maeve looked out the window of the high-rise. Below, the city moved in a chaotic, concrete grid. It looked exhausting. It looked hollow. She thought about the black locust roots cracking the caliche. She thought about the smell of the wet leaves in the morning, the sound of the creek, the way Leo looked when he found a new fox den. She thought about Pete, dying in a panic, trying to get rich quick, leaving nothing behind but debt and dust. $15 million was just a number on a screen. The forest was real. Draft the paperwork, she said. 3 weeks later, the deed transfer was filed with the county clerk. The reaction from Roth's camp was instantaneous silence. The corporate machine simply shut down. The tax reassessment mysteriously stalled in committee. The water board dropped their investigation. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic final phone call. Roth's algorithm had encountered a variable it couldn't solve, a human being who valued dirt more than capital. He simply cut his losses and moved his operation to Nevada. A year passed. It was late October. A heavy autumn storm was rolling across the high desert, dragging a curtain of grey rain behind it. Maeve stood on the porch of a newly built, modest timber frame cabin. She had sold a small, sustainable harvest of mature poplar to a local mill, just enough to pay off the back taxes and drag the trailer off the property for good. The wind howled across the basin, hitting the edge of the property with the force of a freight train. But inside the tree line, the air was still. The interlocking canopies of 10,000 trees absorbed the blow, groaning and swaying, holding the line. The rain hammered down, not pooling on the alkali crust, but sinking deep into the rich, dark soil, feeding the aquifer, feeding the roots. Leo came up onto the porch, shaking the rain from his coat. He was a teenager now, broad-shouldered and quiet, his hands calloused from the Pulaski axe. He stood next to his mother, looking out at the sprawling, wild ecosystem they had engineered out of nothing. "Think it'll hold?" Leo asked, watching the trees sway against the storm. Maeve took a sip of her coffee. She felt the dull, familiar ache in her shoulders, the permanent souvenir of the hard pan. She looked at the deep green of the black locusts, immovable and defiant. "Yeah," Maeve said, her voice steady over the thunder. "It's going to hold. They say money always wins." But Maeve proved that roots dig deeper than greed. She sacrificed generational wealth to protect the world she built with her bare hands, leaving behind a legacy that no billionaire could ever pave over. If Maeve's defiance moved you, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of human resilience. What would you have done for $15 million? Let us know in the comments below.